Hey, for the format for today's Modern War Institute Speaker Series lecture will be similar in the past. So I'll introduce the guest speaker here shortly, who will discuss challenges of building militaries in fragile states. After 20 to 25 minutes of more formal remarks, I'll join her for a series of question and answer before turning it over to the audience for questions. So we'll give you plenty of time to ask questions. So as you come up with those, jot them down so you can ask some intelligent questions at the end and not embarrass us with the dumb ones. Because if you don't ask the good ones, you know someone will ask one that you don't want to be asked. All right, so it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mara Karlin, Associate Professor of the Practice of Strategic Studies with Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where she also serves as the Associate Director of the School of Strategic Studies Program and an Executive Director of the Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. She's also served in a number of national security roles for 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense, advising on policies spanning from strategic planning, defense budgeting, future wars, and the evolving security environment, and regional affairs involving the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. Most recently, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development, and previously served as Special Assistant to Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, where she facilitated efforts of hundreds of national security-related actions with emphasis on the Middle East security affairs, where she served part of that time as Levant Director, formulating U.S. policy for Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Israeli, Palestine actions, for those of you that don't know where the Levant is. And then prior to that is South Asia Country Director, formulating U.S. policy, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, focusing on terrorism, governability, security sector reform, and nonproliferation. So this time I'll turn it over to Dr. Mara Karlin.
All right, y'all, thanks so much for having me. It is such a treat to be here. Thank you to Dr. Boehner and Colonel Collins. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you all about this book that I wrote, and then when it's time for Q&A, we can discuss anything. We can talk about my book. If you like the pitch I made, if you totally disagree with the pitch I make, I would welcome hearing all of those things. We can talk about defense strategy, national security strategy. We can discuss how do you spend a $700 billion budget, what's going on in the Middle East. You name it, I'm here to talk to you all as you wish. So for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, I want to spend some time talking about building partner militaries. I wrote this book, and it was not at all the book I wanted to write. It was actually not the book I intended to write. So as you all grow up, you will learn that the book you are supposed to write is the book that says, what I did in my previous jobs was awesome. Right? I am super successful, and we should keep doing exactly what I did. Got it? That is the right thing to do. My book didn't turn out that way at all. I had spent a number of years in the Pentagon building militaries in fragile states, working with the Lebanese military, the Pakistani military, the Sri Lankan military, a whole bunch of militaries across the world trying to make it so that they could no longer be so fragile, so they could act in our interests. Because we have this problem in the United States, in the national security establishment. Here's the problem. We have increasingly fragile states. This is a state that really can't exert their number one responsibility, which is to secure their territory, right? To secure their population. That's the number one thing I need a state to be able to do. There's a fellow named Max Weber, and he said, you need to be able to exert a monopoly on violence. So I need states to do that. And yet, when I look around the world, there's a whole lot of states that can't. Moreover, that fragility is increasingly affecting the United States, given the nature of transnational threats, and in the post-9/11 environment, it has become a particularly acute problem. The problem is, in particular, we don't want to deal with this ourselves. We don't want to send you all to go fight wars in these fragile states, right? For a whole bunch of reasons. It's expensive, we're worried about casualties, we think it's a distraction, right? Especially if we think that the future is going to be more about conflicts like China and Russia. So what do? You need to find a way to stabilize fragile states cheaply, in blood, in treasure, and in time. So the US military delegates authority. We work by, with, and through others. We try to build their militaries so they can deal with a bunch of problems and y'all don't have to. That's the goal. You know, there's a bunch of examples where this hasn't worked. Let me just walk you through one. The US, for years and years and years, paid for the French to build South Vietnam's military. This was in the 1950s. They failed. So then the US military comes in and spends half a decade trying to build the South Vietnamese military. Massive effort, $500 million in assistance, hundreds and hundreds of people like you all trying to build their military. And yet, South Vietnam's president reorganizes their military according to his preferences, preparing it for the wrong conflict, leaving it ill-equipped for the growing communist insurgency at home. Moreover, his military's leadership remains weak, the command and control completely confused, in addition to the chain of command. Promotions only happen based on loyalty rather than merit. And so as the security situation in South Vietnam starts to deteriorate in 1960, it's clear the military is not capable of dealing with the growing insurgency. It's clear it was poorly led, oriented toward the wrong kind of threat. So just stop for a minute and imagine if that had worked. Imagine if the US effort to build the South Vietnamese military had worked. At a minimum, we would have 58,000 Americans here that are not. So this is, no kidding, serious business that we need to get right. If you were watching your TVs a couple of years ago, you saw as ISIS took over large swaths of Iraq, right? Where you saw huge components of the Iraqi military, who the US had worked with, just throw down their weapons and run. As ISIS took Ramadi, as ISIS took Mosul, as 3 divisions of equipment were abandoned, right? So we have a whole bunch of examples where this hasn't worked. And what I tried to do in the study was figure out, how can we do better? When, why, and under what circumstances is the US military more likely to succeed? Because this issue of fragility isn't going away, and yet we have other priorities that we have to worry about. So I tried to think about what the nature was of American involvement in building these militaries, right? Over the years, how did we do it? How did we work with them? And I also tried to think about the security environment. What was changing in those? And the goal was, you want a more enforced and sustainable monopoly on violence. I want that military in the partner state to fight the threats that I'm worried about so that you all don't have to go to do it. So I looked at a bunch of cases across history, post-World War II, and here's what I found. I found that we're more likely to succeed when the United States gets deeply involved in the partner states' military affairs and when antagonistic external actors play a diminishing role. So what does that actually mean in English? What it means in English is that to successfully build a military, you have to get involved in all of their sensitive affairs. You need to recognize that state-building endeavors are political, not technical exercises. Don't show me an Excel spreadsheet of how much ammo you gave them and how many tanks. Do not distance from key political issues. That's a waste of time, effort, and resources. Indeed, that is a fundamentally flawed approach. If we just think about what equipment did we give them and did you train them on how to use that rifle, that is flawed. Indeed, when we have been more successful in building militaries, we've been more willing to weigh in on higher order issues. Issues like, what is the military's mission? What is its organizational structure? Who are its leaders, and are they in the right positions? Those are issues that profoundly influence a military's capacity, but are often considered too sensitive to touch. You all are probably too young to have a bad boss so far in your life, but it will happen at some point. And I hope when that does happen, it is brief, but I hope you step back for a moment and think, how is that person motivating me or not to do my job well? You may go off and be in an area where you have a skewed mission, where the mission is confused, or the organizational structure doesn't make sense. You will find that all of those dynamics profoundly affect your ability to do your job, let alone your ability to do it well. And so I argue that if we actually want to affect these partner militaries in meaningful, transformative ways, we need to get into their business. We need to try to influence all of these things. I also argue that we need to worry about third parties. There are a bunch of parties who do not have an interest in what we're trying to do. So if I want to strengthen a certain country's military, like Lebanon's military or Pakistan's military, there will be third parties who want to exploit that weakness, who actually find it in their interest for those countries' militaries to be weak, who like the fact that there's not a monopoly on violence there. That means we need to recognize this is not just a bilateral two-person dance, right? It's not just us and the partner state. There's a whole bunch of other actors out there, some of whom are good and some of whom are not good. Let me spend a few minutes walking through an example of one of the cases that I looked at and explaining what this looks like. So I want you to picture, just after World War II ends, I want you to picture Greece. Anyone here ever visited Greece? Okay, so this will not be the delightful experience I suspect you had at beaches or walking around Athens. All right, when you picture Greece at this moment in time, I want you to picture Syria today. Rampant starvation, disease, a ravaged landscape, a totally destroyed infrastructure. Literally 300,000 people had died just from starvation. The military is in terrible shape. It's small, its morale is low, it's poorly paid. The best quote to describe it is by then Secretary of State Dean Acheson, who says, "Greece was in the position of a semi-conscious patient on the critical list, whose relatives and physicians have been discussing whether his life could be saved." Right? So this is a hideous situation. And they're fighting communist guerrillas who are getting help from Albania, Yugoslavia, and Bulgaria. In building the Greek military, the US, after some fits and starts, takes a radically different approach than it had previously. It becomes very deep in sensitive military affairs. So it helps the military rethink their mission to focus on these insurgents. It helps reorganize the military to ensure that its organizational structure is tied to this mission of fighting communist guerrillas rather than foreign armies. The US influences leadership in a way that I found almost mind-boggling, making sure capable leaders were appointed to the right positions. The US oversaw a complete overhaul of military personnel, including the chief of staff, getting all of the lieutenant generals in the entire Greek army except for one to resign, facilitating the promotion and placement of 8 major generals, regularly encouraging the removal of division and corps commanders who weren't supporting the broader strategy. Imagine that, right? Imagine working with a partner military and changing out, or at least recommending changing out leadership in a whole bunch of key areas. You also see some really interesting dynamics broader than the US military. You see a unity of vision in the national security apparatus. You see across the board willingness by President Truman to ensure that all parties in Washington are on the same page here. That they understand that the team in Athens and the team in Washington have to get along. That you need a charismatic leader to run the effort to build the Greek military. You get this in a fellow named Lieutenant General James Van Fleet, right? Because who runs things matters. Moreover, you see regular reassessments across Washington about when, why, and how you might want to change this effort. Regular assessments that President Truman runs to step back and say, do we want to become a co-combatant? Is this important enough that we don't think the Greek military is doing as good of a job as we want, and so we need to fight on behalf of them? They regularly decide not to do that, but they ask that question. I can give you a ton of examples where everything I just told you doesn't stand. So in Lebanon, for example, during the 1980s, the person running the US effort to work with the Lebanese military tried to get the head of the military to conduct a coup. Not US policy. You also have in Lebanon a situation where someone from the US team decides to offer folks who are no longer in positions of authority in the military access to covert weapons. Also, not US policy, right? So the person you have in matters. Remember that Vietnam example I was talking about? So that effort is run by a leader known as Hanging Sam Williams. He's Lieutenant General. He was relieved of command in World War II. That should tell you something about who he is. So he was relieved of command in World War II. He completely disagreed with the embassy officials in Saigon, ignoring them, mocking the ambassador publicly. He kowtowed to the South Vietnamese leadership and was unwilling to push them. The best description of him comes from his biographer, usually someone who will write positively of you, who says he caused ulcers, mid-career burnout, heart attacks, divorces, and the resignations of commissioned officers of the regular army. Right? So imagine when that's your leader. Imagine how that affects you. And you see this, in fact, in the reports by the advisors. One person said, you know, a man from Mars would think this effort was actually working because they had a boss who fomented a command climate that said, you're not going to disagree with me. Right? So leadership matters. And if you have certain leaders who want to push a different view, you're not actually going to succeed. I can give you a bunch of examples where we don't actually step back and assess the US role, like I had discussed in Greece, where you saw a concerted effort to think about whether or not the US military should become a co-combatant. Great example of this is Lebanon in the early 80s. You have the Marines that are sent as peacekeepers, but they're clearly not seen as peacekeepers, right? The USS New Jersey is firing on the Syrians, on militias, on Iranians, at the same time that these Marine peacekeepers are there. And so what ends up happening? The Marine barracks bombing, 1983. So we can't fool ourselves about our role. We have to try to understand what it is and how are others seeing it. There's a bunch of contemporary examples we can talk about in Q&A if you want, whether it's what Hezbollah did in Lebanon a decade ago or the situation in Syria today. So in addition to this idea of getting involved in sensitive affairs, I talked a little bit about the external threat environment. What happened with Greece is because the US had so smartly built their military and had been willing to push on all these sensitive affairs, as there started to become a shift in the external threat environment, as Yugoslavia diminished its support for communist insurgents, the Greek military could take advantage of that change and was able to defeat the guerrillas. So in just a few years, a US effort that consists of a couple $100 million results in only 4 US casualties, ends up succeeding. You have a country that was on the brink of complete failure actually coming together. That's incredible if you think about it, and not always the case in the external threat environment. As one of the Syrian vice presidents said, the United States is short of breath. You can always wait them out. If you think that, then you're probably not going to be willing to make changes. So you may say, this is really interesting, but what if it's completely impractical? What if I'm not dealt a good hand? What if I can't actually do these things you're suggesting? And there's a bunch of reasons why that might not be possible, right? It might be that the partner state doesn't want to talk about these sensitive issues. It might be that they don't trust what we're doing. They might have a completely different agenda, so the guys that you think are bad guys, they actually don't think are bad guys, and they don't want to be convinced. They might think, look, the United States is going to support me anyway. It doesn't really matter if I make any change. Or they may think the US is unwilling to crack down on external actors because we have other priorities vis-a-vis them, right? Pakistan, Afghanistan is a great example here. We can talk about more in Q&A if you want. So if that is the case, if you say, look, I just don't think these recommendations are feasible in this example I'm dealing with. I'm getting sent out to Beirut next year, and I just don't think this is feasible. What do you do? I think you conclude one of two things. You either conclude that you're still going to work with this military, but it is going to be a limited security sector reform effort. Limited train and equip efforts can be useful. Very limited buy with and through efforts can be helpful. You all get some practice. Maybe you professionalize them a little bit. Maybe you get a little bit of intel. All potentially helpful. That is fine as long as you recognize that limited US involvement is going to have a limited impact. And do not delude yourself. Do not think if we just work harder, if we just give them more assistance, if we just change our acquisition system so it's faster. Do not delude yourself, because those will be marginal changes and unsatisfying ones. I'll give you one quick example. When the Lebanese military fought its first fight effectively ever in 2007, the US raced 40 C-130s and C-17s filled with material. If you turned on the television, you saw these planes land at Beirut International Airport, and then all the material taking off them, heloed to where this fight was. They were fighting against an al-Qaeda affiliate. Pretty amazing. This happened within days. The system never works that fast. And yet, the Lebanese across the board, up to and including the chief of staff, just mocked it. They said, we didn't get anything from the Americans. We didn't get anything but promises and best wishes and some ammunition. That's what the head of the military said. If you turned on Lebanese television, you saw them mocking U.S. aid, and you saw them showing actors pretending to be U.S. military officials handing out socks and toy airplanes to Lebanese generals. So even under the rare circumstance where you're as fast and efficient as possible, it's still not going to work if you just focus on training and on equipment. You have to focus on these sensitive issues, according to my research. So if you've walked in and you've said, look, this is infeasible in whichever country I'm going to, you can conclude, fine, I'm still going to do it, but it's going to be a limited effort. Or you may conclude, I'm not going to do it. The costs outweigh the benefits. In these cases, it is better to acknowledge that and to find another way to deal with the problem rather than merely deluding ourselves that we will effectively build this military. Why don't I wrap up there, and I look forward to your questions.
Jack, you want to move this?
Thank you. Thanks so much.
There's water.
Thanks.
All right, Mara, I guess I will, let's see where I want to start here. I guess one of the questions, you provide Greece as a success story.
Indeed.
But the problem with that is post-World War II, more than 60 years ago, maybe it was a Cold War, maybe things have changed over time. So, maybe it's a civil-mil dynamic, maybe it's post-1986 Goldwater Department of Defense Reorganization Act. Are there things that have fundamentally changed that's not necessarily a useful lesson to learn from now, or maybe it's still useful, but do we have any post-Cold War success stories?
That's a really important question. We do have examples of success, but it does matter how you assess success. What do you think success actually is? So I painted a really ugly picture of Greece, right? I said use the analogy of Syria today. We all know how hideous that is. And so is Greece a terribly functioning country today? That's questionable, but it is not on the verge of total collapse the way that it was. If we look at more recent examples, I think Jordan is a really interesting one. In Jordan, and some of you may get the opportunity to work with the Jordanian military, they're relatively capable. We have a very good mill-to-mill relationship. They are, frankly, generally willing to work with the U.S. on key issues. So I think that absolutely is one. And that is, I should note, a real post-9/11 relationship. I mean, that's really when the U.S. doubles down on Jordan as kind of being the key capable military in a region, frankly, not filled with capable militaries.
Your book, you focus on building militaries in fragile states by the U.S., but are there other nations that do it better or have more success, the French or the British or even the Russians, or does everyone suck at this?
It's a really interesting question. One of the challenges I found when I was doing this research was that I didn't think the Brit and the French examples were great, because generally when they were working with militaries, it was their colonies. And I think it is a markedly different effort when it is your colony. I mean, this is frankly why Iraq and Afghanistan are a little difficult to try to judge in this sense, not for the many other reasons we know. But in particular, it is different when you are occupying a country, when you are running a country whole hog. Ideally, in all of these examples, we're not doing that, right? If we get to the situation where we're sending 100,000 troops to occupy Lebanon, we have failed. That is a real problem.
All right, so you're critical of the U.S. reluctance to weigh in on higher order questions, right, of mission, organizational structure, and personnel, and instead focus on the training and equip mission. But how much ability do we truly have to leverage if you have other nations out there that are willing to provide support without conditionality? So I visited more than 20 embassies in the Arabian Peninsula, the Maghreb, and Levant, and Africa, and the story's pretty much the same everywhere, at least relayed to me from the embassy leadership. And the nation may change, but it's kind of the story is the Chinese give us what we want, the U.S. gives us what they think we need. Mm-hmm. And so what challenge does this pose for our ability to influence structural change through conditionality if they believe they can turn somewhere else?
Absolutely. So let me offer two thoughts. Thought one is you have to help them understand they're getting more than just a piece of equipment, right? So it's all well and good for the Russians to say, you can buy X helicopter from us. Well, those training manuals are going to be in Russian. And oh, by the way, you're going to be buying them. This will not be a gift the way that you often get from the United States. Moreover, you now get interoperability with the United States. So if you want us to be next to you in some sort of conflict, you probably want to have the same stuff as us, right? You want to have an excuse for us to have all of you all grow up with their militaries, et cetera. The second point I would make is, and this is one where I think the research has really shifted my thinking dramatically. So if we were all sitting here 10 years ago, before I researched this book, when I was just leaving the Pentagon after my first 5-year stint, I would have said we should not get involved in sensitive affairs, right? I'll give you a whole bunch of examples where we might muck it up, and for that reason, we shouldn't try to tell countries what to do or what not to do. And this research has completely changed my thinking on it. So when I went back into the Pentagon, 2012 to 2017, I tried to put this in action. And what I found so astonishing was how often countries actually wanted to hear our thoughts. Whether or not they would follow them, open question. But they wanted to at least hear them. They were regularly asking us, what do you think we should do here? What do you want? And so we actually inaugurated a whole program working with some of our very closest NATO allies, where when they were doing their defense strategies, we effectively said to them in classified form, here's what we think your military should be able to do. Here's the sort of conflicts that we think you're going to be next to us in. And so this is not an example with fragile states, of course, but it does show how even the most, frankly, capable forces want to hear from the United States, given our role internationally, want to hear from us, please do X, not Y. Know that this is where we are. Moreover, as all of you no doubt know, the US government has a whole lot of voices. And there's something especially useful about saying at the most senior level, in one voice, here's what we're thinking. You know, we want you to worry about, say, the threat in Europe. We don't want you to worry about, say, the counterinsurgent, the insurgent threat in the Middle East.
So we've had a fairly robust train and equip effort for Ukraine over the last few years to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. But the goal is much more than just train and equip, right? It involves larger institutional reforms such as Western norms for civilian control of the military, NCO, professionalized NCO Corps, reforms within their officer corps. And so for 2 years, I served as General Abizade's executive officer for a SecDef appointed role as senior defense advisor to the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. To help reform Ukraine's defense establishment and produce a more capable force that meets Western norms and NATO standards. Obviously, you wouldn't be surprised, one of the challenges we face, right, is not necessarily having a U.S. policy makes it hard to kind of figure out what it is
Indeed it does.
that you're trying to do. But I would ask, if President Trump asked you to make a recommendation on how to improve their military, right, if we're looking at building their military, what advice would you give? And I guess partly it's shaped by your research here, but also your understanding of, using international relations theory and whether or not you believe, right, is it response to realism, or is it domestic explanations for what the Russians are doing, or is it pure Russian imperialism? It's cultural. So what would you say we should be doing in Ukraine, and kind of where does that recommendation come from?
Absolutely. So, this is an important point Colonel Collins is making, so let me just foot stomp it. It's really hard to do things absent a policy, right? Because you can go any which way. Frankly, the way the US government system is set up, right, it is designed to constrain action. It's hard to do things even when you do have a policy, right? And you might think that that's not accurate, but it absolutely is, right? People have their own interests, they have their own parochialism, you name it. They may not buy into the policy, so it's hard enough when you don't have, when you have one. It's especially hard when you don't have one. So were the president to ask me, first what I would want to do is think about NATO. There does need to be, in my mind, a clear red line if you are on Team NATO or if you are not on Team NATO. And I think that needs to color how deeply one is willing to get involved in what's going on across European militaries. Now, obviously, with Ukraine, you don't have a country that is in NATO, but a country that we care about, right? And not a country to whom we might go to their defense. Indeed, we have not in recent years. But we want them to be able to be scrappy and to do something. That is in our interest. We want them to make things more difficult for the Russians. So some sort of effort, I think, makes a ton of sense. What I would probably want to do is think through what are the sorts of conflicts that we could see them getting into? And I think the one I would probably worry about the most would be some sort of gray zone warfare with the Russians. And then how do we train, equip, and advise that force so it can capably do so? So not knowing the dynamics within that Ministry of Defense terribly well, I'd want to think through, what do they think the mission is? You know, to what extent are they worried about high-end conventional conflict? To what end are they worried about gray zone conflict? Are they actually just focused on the Russians? What else are they focused on? How do you really help them prioritize? What sort of training are they doing along those lines? What kind of equipment do they need to purchase or to get gifted based on whatever kind of conflict scenario they're thinking through? And then I would want to have advisors, frankly, at the most senior levels of the Ministry of Defense. The Pentagon has a program like this in which it tries to build institutions of key states. And I think this is one where it would be a perfect example. But look, at the end of the day, it needs to be very clear that if something happens with a NATO ally and they say jump, the US will say how high. It is a different line. It is not a red line, but it is a different line with those who are not in NATO.
All right, so bring it something to probably that's more relevant to the cadets' immediate future, or probably more for our rotational officers that are going back out to the force. So with the recent creation of the Security Force Assistant Brigades, the SFABs, how will this impact the challenge of building foreign militaries in any way? You could see the case of maybe, you could argue, you know, state building, as you said, is more political than technical. So does creating the SFABs only exacerbate the problem because we're looking at really, once again, just training and equipping versus the higher level complexities? Or does this signal some kind of understanding of the complexity in some way, and so we're committing more to the problem, not just in terms of the technical aspect, or is it really too early to tell?
Can I give you an answer that's both 2 and 3?
Yes.
Look, it is too early to tell, right? SFAB is a really new concept. There are a couple things that I've seen that are positive. So first, SFAB appeared to be composed of superstars. That's really important. Remember that story I told you about hanging Sam Williams? That is not the guy you want running your SFAB. And by all accounts, that is not the case. So that's really, really meaningful. But too early to tell. I guess what I find interesting is, you know, the creation of the SFAB is really kind of one of the key organizational changes we see in the Army in the post-9/11 environment. This is an Army that has been at war now for 17, 18 years and finally comes out and recognizes, arguably, let's be honest, 10 years too late, hey, we're going to keep working with these partner militaries, and we need to figure out how to do it. We need to focus on it. Moreover, given that the National Defense Strategy says you need to worry a whole lot more about high-end conflict with China and Russia, I think General Milley's headspace was probably in, this isn't going away, but I need to deal with it in a sustainable manner, all of which makes sense. So I'll be really curious to watch with the next few SFABs, what kind of training do they get? What kind of impact are they actually having? And above all, who is going to the SFABs and what are they doing after they pop out of the SFAB?
So you don't mention human rights at all, at least you didn't in the lecture today, maybe in the book a little bit more. But has Leahy law and amendments, have those been some success in terms of keeping our partners from violating international laws? You could turn to, I mean, some would argue Colombia is somewhat of a success. But have those been successful in shaping some of these militaries in fragile states and having some success, even if not total success?
It has had an impact. It's pretty clear when you work with the U.S. military, there are certain laws that the U.S. military will follow. There are certain ways that the military will engage civilians, and when it screws that up, it will hold folks accountable. And at the end of the day, while being flexible on those may have short-term gains, in the long term, they won't at all. I think what's interesting with Leahy law is, so effectively saying if you're committing human rights violations, we can't work with that unit. What's interesting is other countries have similar laws, but they implement them very differently. So for Australia, their Leahy law equivalent says you can't work with individuals. So for example, let's say you have a company and there's one toxic individual in that company. That individual is one who couldn't work with the U.S. military as opposed to the whole unit. I think there's probably some work to be done in terms of what Leahy looks like in that implementation, but on the whole, we have seen some positive successes.
Do you think there's some selection issues present with, I mean, in terms of where we go, right? So we tend to really go and reform the really hard cases, and maybe we'd have more successes if it's, you know, maybe if there were more Greases that maybe they were more likely for success in the Vietnam or or in Iraq. So, I mean, how would you, what would you have to say on that?
Absolutely. So I do think there's a selection bias. There's a whole lot of fragile states that we just don't care about, right? You have to be honest, right? Strategy is all about prioritization. You have to prioritize and you have to worry about your opportunity cost. Because anytime I'm spending working with the Colombian military means I'm not spending that time with the Pakistani military. It's fun. It's just what it is. I'm sure many of you all have studied ends, ways, and means or started to think about these things. You have to obsess over priorities, which means there may be a terribly dysfunctional military somewhere in the world that's doing all sorts of terrible things, but it's just not on our list, right? It just isn't, because it doesn't actually hit US national security interests. Part of the reason I focused on the specific ones I do in this book, where I look at countries like Greece, Lebanon, and South Vietnam, is because the US has a real national security interest at that moment in time in making sure that country doesn't flame out. The other piece of selection bias worth noting, these are all ugly cases, right? So success is not flourishing democracy a la France or Great Britain. Success is, as the term is going to become popular, Afghan good enough, right? Success is marginally functional. Really low expectations here. It's like a C-.
So I kind of hinted at it a little bit before, but if you're trying to implement this change, I mean, you have some recommendations, but trying to get the government to work together without having, it's got to be organized or incentivized to actually do that. Otherwise, it's kind of good, but they get overcome by the daily grind. So what kind of structural changes or organizational changes or incentives would you change to try to get it so you can have more of this unity of effort like you had in Greece, and less so the others? I mean, are geographical combatant commanders too empowered, or is their budgets just dwarfing everything else? Is it because it's the easy tool in the box, and we pretty much, everybody else has been cut so much that the only place to go is, and then the organization inherently thinks at the kind of train and equip level and not the political level. So what kind of, how do we capture these changes and try to make them last?
Absolutely. Let me offer a couple thoughts. The Defense Department does not have any real trouble with money. Now, we may say, oh, sure, would like a budget of $750 billion instead of $700 billion, but these are fantasy numbers, right? And at the end of the day, you should really say, I don't care what the number is, tell me how you're spending it, right? What are you actually buying for with that money? If 45% of it is going to people, does that make sense or not? How is it distributed among the services? Those are the questions you should ask, not is it the right number. That is not an interesting or meaningful question. That said, when you walk into the State Department or USAID, those numbers are incomprehensible to them, right? You are dealing with such an order of magnitude in terms of the number of people you have, the budget, the, frankly, strategic planning culture that militaries have, particularly the US military and the defense apparatus more broadly. The challenge here then becomes, you have the State Department, which is consistently woefully underfunded. I mean, there's no debate over this. You've seen this administration after administration in all sorts of sad ways. I remember my first few weeks in the Pentagon back just after 9/11, meeting with colleagues at the State Department, and they were showing me their numbers, and I had never seen so few zeros. I mean, it was actually perplexing, right? These are not numbers we would ever talk about in the Pentagon. Moreover, the American people have the vaguest notion of who you are and what you do. Really vague. They have no idea what the State Department does. At best, they will be on vacation in Spain and they will lose their luggage and their passport, and some very sweet consular officer in the middle of the night will help them get a new passport. Other than that, they don't understand what diplomacy looks like because they haven't had to engage it, almost surely, and they kind of see folks in uniform and seem to understand here's what a military does. So you're never going to have a real constituency across the public or in Congress that says, therefore, let's fund the State Department. If you look back to when Secretary Gates was the Secretary of Defense, he made arguments along these lines. Secretary Mattis made arguments along these lines, all saying, please fund the State Department, right? If you don't fund them more, we're going to have to do more in the military. And yet it just consistently doesn't happen. That is one kind of just huge challenge, I think, that really, really plays into this issue. Obviously, balance of power issues within the department also do, and I think your point on the combatant commanders is a profoundly valid one and only becoming more so. So what do you do? Winston Churchill had this great quote. He said, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally assess the results. So how well am I actually doing, right? If I say I'm going to get an A in this class, and halfway through the semester my average is a D+, I should step back and say, Maybe I need to study differently. Maybe I got to go to office hours. Something is clearly not working here. And yet what will often happen with the US government is you will have a policy put in place and then you run to make it happen. You don't often have natural times to reassess. So one of my biggest suggestions is actually the idea of reassessment. And in fact, come February, when it's time for the posture hearings, right after the Secretary of Defense puts out the Pentagon's budget, for the very first time, the Pentagon gets a new homework assignment that it will have to answer, which is, how's our strategy doing? This was a new piece of law that came out in the fiscal year 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, which effectively says, yes, every 4 years you tell me what your defense strategy is. Every year you got to tell me how it's going. What did you think that was right? Where are you wrong? What changes are you making? I think steps like that are fantastic, and I would like to institutionalize them as much as possible.
All right, I'll ask one final question before turning over to the audience for questions. So that's your guys' hint to get ready here. The cadets may soon find themselves out there building militaries in fragile states in the not-so-distant future, and the same goes for our captains and our majors. So what advice would you give them if they find themselves executing what you would describe as failed or seriously flawed strategy? What, if anything, can they do at that, realizing the level they're at, to try to improve the situation so they're not just kind of almost serving no purpose?
Absolutely. You can see clarity and be transparent. So what do I mean by that? See clarity. What is it that you think that military's mission is? And what is it that you think your mission is out there? And is there a contradiction between those? And if we just use that example, be transparent. Make it clear to your leadership what is working and what isn't working. And some of that may be a dig on you, right? So one of the challenges you have with building the South Vietnamese military, almost none of these advisors actually speak Vietnamese, right? And so their ability to interact with the folks that they're training is severely limited. No doubt that might be an issue. And look, that's a knock on you, but it is what it is. You can't imagine that you're actually going to know the language of half the places you'll get sent. But being transparent also means show what you think is or is not working based on what you can control. So if your boss thinks that the unit you're working with is really capable, but you have 3 pieces of evidence that don't match up with it, be comfortable saying to your boss, look, sir, here's what I'm seeing that doesn't actually track with what we think. Right? Be comfortable trying to say that. Obviously, as I mentioned before in terms of the toxic boss issue, sometimes you'll get a great boss and sometimes you won't, and you'll have to figure out what that looks like in your command climate. I would also say then being transparent means talking to your peers. If you're seeing the same sort of dysfunction in one unit that your peer is seeing in another unit and replicated a few other places, there is something about numbers, right? To be able to say, we're working with these 10 units and it turns out 8 of them all have these same problems. Telling the boss that, getting that evidence is all really meaningful. So try to seek clarity and be transparent to the extent you can.
All right, I'll turn it over to the audience for questions. I think we have a couple microphones or not?
Yeah, receivers out here.
Okay, got it. Okay, either way, then just stand up and ask the question loudly so everybody can hear. Yeah.
Thanks for your speech. How does the U.S. justify or overlook atrocities or human rights violations that are committed using the technology that we provide their nation?
You mean Yemen?
I was referring to Israel and the Palestinian conflict.
Okay. So this is a really, really important point to think about. There are, you give countries these weapons, and it is based on a whole bunch of assessments, right? Do we think they'll maintain control of it? Are they going to give it to all sorts of nefarious actors? That would be really problematic. Do we think that they will use it appropriately? Against whom? Do we have a relationship with them where we can engage on these issues? It can be especially hard, frankly, once that material then arrives in country. Where I would think about, at least with the example you're mentioning, and then I'll talk about Yemen, is I would think about what does the military's leadership do when there are violations? And so I think the answer you would hear from the Pentagon is, if there are violations, the Israeli military leadership will deal with them. I thought you were actually going toward Yemen, as I briefly noted, and sort of the quick and dirty here in Yemen is for the first time the Saudis and Emiratis have decided to use all the equipment they've spent millions and millions of dollars on over years and years, and they're using it in Yemen. And it turns out they seem to be most effectively killing civilians. and not actually killing all sorts of nefarious actors, which is inconvenient, obviously, to put it mildly. And so the U.S. has started some serious talks about what that assistance looks like. Congress in particular has pushed this. You know, we have a complicated system of government designed to constrain action, as I said, in which a whole bunch of voices think that they have a role, and they're right. And so Congress has gotten very hyper on the Yemen piece. You've seen this with legislation. You will only see this more and more in the coming months, I promise. So what I expect will happen is that U.S. material support to the Saudis in particular will probably stop along these lines. We've already seen a real downgrading in U.S. operational support. Effectively, the argument was, if the U.S. advises, say, the Saudi Air Force how, on how best to use this material, then there will be fewer civilian casualties. That appears not to have been true because they're, as I said, they've only managed to continue killing civilians in kind of all sorts of wild numbers. So this is a really interesting case to watch over these coming months because you have a ton of interest in it across Washington. And if you follow Saudi Arabia at all, it sort of plays into a whole lot of other things that are happening along those lines with the new Saudi leadership and the reform effort and, you know, chopping up a journalist, et cetera.
Before going up there real quick,
Yes.
in terms of human rights or Leahy vetting, I mean, what's your take on that? You know, some will say, hey, right, you don't want to work with units that commit human rights violations, but then how do we influence change if we're not allowed to work with them? Right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, it's
Right.
kind of the chicken and the egg argument.
Absolutely, and that's the piece where it matters in terms of units versus entire militaries. So let's pretend, hypothetically, that Congress says, look, there are a whole bunch of units in the Saudi Air Force that have committed all sorts of violations and you cannot work with them. However, you would still have the capability to work with the Saudi military in other ways. And so I would say you don't want to put a wall up and completely cut off the relationship. That's not going to be helpful, right? You might be able to influence them. So what you would want to do in that situation, for example, is you'd want to still talk to the Ministry of Defense. You'd want to still talk to the Saudi Air Force. You'd want to find other ways to try to influence them. And frankly, help them understand that they're working against their own interests. I mean, this is why Yemen is also such an interesting case study. The Saudis have a whole lot of things to worry about, and yet their efforts to destabilize and further foment friction in Yemen actually don't help their bigger worries against Iran and other domestic concerns.
Yeah, go ahead.
So pulling that thread a little bit, ma'am. So regarding the U.S. political and diplomatic relationship with Saudi Arabia, prior to Yemen, did you make the argument that it was in our interest to maintain their military at a low level of performance to cause them to require support from us continually in order for our own political benefit to have access in the region? Because we've been in Saudi Arabia since, the agreements with President Roosevelt. And so they have not developed a level of independence that doesn't require our support. But could you say that we're okay with that, provided that we still have access to the strategic benefits of access, space, and overflight?
So what I'm hearing from you is a good question about, do we still work with them if we assume that they're always going to be totally incapable, right? If they're militarily kind of going to be incapable, should I still work with them for strategic reasons? That's absolutely a valid question, right? I don't necessarily work with militaries to make them capable, right? I may work with them because I need their prime minister to vote with us in the United Nations. I may work with them because I want to figure out what's actually going on there because let's say they have a nuclear weapons program and I'm really worried about command and control. There's a bunch of reasons why you might work with a military that don't actually involve operational effectiveness. That may sound totally contradictory, and yet when you shoot it up to a strategic, political, military level, I hope that it makes sense. So the Saudis are an interesting example along these lines. Literally for decades, the Saudis were spending mass amounts on U.S. material. They were never using it. The idea that the Saudis would ever actually fight and do something just didn't cross the minds of anyone. When I worked in the Bush administration in the early aughts, President Bush announced this Gulf Security Dialogue. And the idea was, all of the Gulf states are coming to us complaining about Iran. Let's get them to work together and collaborate and try to figure out how they might deal with the Iran threat together. It totally failed. You've seen similar efforts with the Obama administration. This administration has tried it with this Middle East Security Alliance. The problem is none of them actually get along terribly well. And while they may dislike the Iranians, they don't dislike them enough to actually work with one another. and they generally have not actually fought or done anything. So you now have this really interesting dilemma. For the first time, they're trying to fight, and yet they're doing a terrible, terrible job. I think that was really the argument in 2015 or so, 2016, when the US said, look, we will help your military. We will give you advice. We get you've never fought a war before. You don't really know how to do this stuff. Let's help you figure it out. The challenge is we're sitting here in 2019. They really haven't gotten any better. So at some point, you have to figure out the moral hazard argument. To what extent is your support helpful? Moreover, remember that big strategic level I mentioned? At the strategic level, you actually see all sorts of really problematic things that the Saudi leadership is doing. And so working with them, I think, is a whole lot more questionable, let alone kind of depending on them. I mean, remember, this is a leadership in which, you know, the Crown Prince's mom is still under house arrest by him. He arrested much of his family. He effectively kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon. I mentioned, you know, Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who he chopped up, you know, ordered to be chopped up with a bone saw. I mean, there's a whole lot of kind of really terrible decisions that we're seeing come out of the Saudi leadership. And at some point, one does have to ask the question of whether or not this is a relationship that is making the region more stable or actually less stable. I mean, if I'm sitting in Tehran, I'm very excited about everything the Saudi leadership is doing.
Yeah.
Ma'am, that's Gina here. So when we were talking about doubling down and increasing our involvement in all these places, I just come to think of examples, for instance, Iraq that we mentioned earlier, with the Iraqis just throwing down their weapons and basically turning as soon as they come in contact with ISIS. And so my question is, does increasing our involvement just create a total dependence on us? And if so, like, what are we going to do about that?
It's a really, really crucial question. To some extent, yes. Right? To some extent, when a country is profoundly desperate and you are there saying, I'm here for you, they're going to be more willing to work with you, right? Because you're all they've got, right? It's either you or the regime falls, and at the end of the day, regimes care most about actually staying in power. So you do have that near-term dependence. Ideally, if you smartly work on building their military, if you work with them on political capabilities, they will actually distance themselves increasingly from you, right? They will grow more independent. In fact, there'll be this kind of ironic inverse effort where their willingness to have you muck around in their knickers, to have you muck around in their sensitive affairs, will actually be, their willingness will actually be much lower as they become more capable. And yet, at the end of the day, if these are fragile countries with whom we have a major national security interest in not melting, we need to find a way to try to work with them. The alternatives aren't so great, right? The alternative of sending a couple 100,000 of you all to go fight and win a war in these places, not ideal.
Yeah, go ahead.
Ma'am, how can the United States ensure, or at least more clearly ensure, that the military structures and leadership it creates when it builds militaries are maintained in order to avoid situations like the South Vietnamese president reorganizing their military contrary to the United States back French efforts in the 1950s?
Absolutely. So part of it is you do have to have this willingness, right? So the challenge in that example is you have hanging Sam Williams, who doesn't want to hear it, who is very clear at all his advisor conferences in saying, I don't want to hear it, everything is fine. He screams at the ambassador. It's amazing. Some of the salacious exchanges between them are kind of extraordinary. His comments about how the ambassador wasn't good enough to work in a ladies' shoe store, not great, obviously, in terms of state DoD cooperation. And in particular, he doesn't want anyone to complain about the South Vietnamese leadership. So not only are you not getting a good diagnosis, what's going on, what effect are we having, how capable are they, you're also not getting any real prescription because you're not willing to engage the partner force and say, look, President Diem, this thing isn't working. Look, we need you to do that. Because he's very clear that he does not want to hear any complaints about President Diem. He says, this is my dear friend. I don't want him to be referred to with all sorts of expletives. So that's a real challenge, right? You have to be willing to do all of those things. Now, your challenge in particular will be willing to do that inside the family, right? So if you are maybe out in a defense attaché shop or a security cooperation shop out in an embassy, or if you're at Army HQ and you're looking at some of these efforts, your responsibility will be to try to say, hey, I think this thing is working or I think this thing is not working. Try to build evidence for that to facilitate that dialogue at the more senior levels.
Ma'am, your approach is to deal with fragile states that have like a history of governments. Do you make a distinction using that in failed states such as Afghanistan and Somalia that have not had a history of centralized government, that might lack the institutions necessary to influence in order to create a more coherent response?
So this may be an issue of semantics, but perhaps it is not. I don't use the term failed state. I think what I'm hearing from you is sort of a distinction between the strength of the center, and I'm not sure that to me speaks to success or failure. The reason I don't use the term failed state or ungoverned, which was like a hot term a decade and a half ago, is because these places usually aren't completely failed, and they actually are governed somewhat just by people we don't like. Right? So there's a push to call Syria, let's say, a failed state. I wouldn't call Syria a failed state. Right? The Assad regime is, in fact, doing a half-decent job governing in the way it wants large swaths of it, for example. I wouldn't call Lebanon a failed state. Just all my examples are generally Middle East. I wouldn't call Lebanon that necessarily. You've got Hezbollah. That's really kind of the power behind the throne. I don't like Hezbollah. I don't want them to govern it, but I can't call this a failed state, per se. So to me, it's more of kind of a continuum of fragility. And I'd say the same thing with Afghanistan. I mean, if you look pre-9/11, right, you have the Taliban running Afghanistan. Again, I don't like them. I don't think they're great, but we can't say that no one's in charge to a degree.
Yeah, final.
Kind of a three-part question. I don't know, maybe I won't get all of these in, but I wonder if you could say something more about corruption. You talk about capabilities, you talk about human rights a little bit, but there's a divide in the literature about kind of naming and shaming versus not working with them, or how do you kind of impose your definition of what corruption is? Because there's always going to be some corruption that goes
Absolutely.
and you need it. And what's the sort of role of that in training? Second thing I want, and this picks up on Max's question on will to fight. There's a new Rand report that really looks at will to fight. It's qualitative. How do we measure that as political scientists, as future? We're thinking about in terms of training, like the Iraqi army example is perfect. I mean, the Russians, the Chinese haven't fought a war since '79. How do we know their will to fight if we were thinking about how to train? Third thing, and I think you were there actually, but this idea of pushing back at you about the sensitivity and getting into the sensitive, how do we avoid being proselytizing? And I'm thinking to myself of Jason Dempsey's example of the Marriott hotel chain that goes into Mongolia, and they've got a kind of in a box what a hotel chain looks like because it works in Des Moines, Iowa. Well, let's just imply it in Mongolia and it'll work. And how do we avoid having this normative kind of not getting into the local cultural sensitivity, and avoiding that kind of, we know best kind of thing. And
Absolutely. So to take them in opposite order, how you do this matters, right? So you could easily walk up to any of these militaries and say, man, your chief of staff is terrible and dumber than a rock. You guys don't know how to use any of your equipment. Your training is awful. Your mission makes no sense and is farcical. I mean, so that is kind of obviously one extreme approach.
That sounds like some people have told us.
Yeah, it's questionable. But there's a whole bunch of other ways, right? So I had used this example of working with a bunch of countries on their defense strategies, which, if you think about it, is the most sensitive issue a military can really pull together. What are you going to do, and how are you going to use all of the money, right? How do you think about use of force? What are the wars that you're no kidding planning for and thinking you're going to fight? And and that experience really made me reflect on the how, right? So talking to them about the various dynamics, doing a real listening tour. What are the different interests? What are the parochial interests? What are those bureaucratic dynamics? From that, being able to say, look, here's where our headspace is. Here's what kind of meet people where they are. Here's why we think these things, and therefore pulling out your suggestions. So I do think the how matters a ton. Obviously, ideally, you have some sort of appreciation of local culture and the dynamics in local history. You had asked about corruption. I have not studied corruption deeply, but I will say, and maybe this is just having spent a couple decades dealing with the Middle East, I'm probably more comfortable accepting a degree of corruption than others might be, because I do think there is sort of something inherent in these systems. Now, in the long term, that is not necessarily helpful. And if you don't actually have a deep understanding of where the kind of where the corruption is going and what that looks like, I think that's going to be really problematic. But frankly, it's not the first thing on my list. And then finally, this issue of will to fight, I think, is a fascinating one. And it is one, frankly, that I think we often get wrong in our field. I remember there was this period of time, 06, 07, 08, where you kept hearing that we were winning in Afghanistan because most of the violence was constrained to just a few of the provinces. That's a totally flawed way of understanding will to fight, right? That doesn't mean that the Taliban, that we had effectively won in, say, 15 of these provinces, right? It quite possibly could have meant, and it turns out it did, that actually they didn't have a lot of faith that they needed to waste time fighting us, right? We were probably not going to be there in large numbers for that much longer. So why waste the energy fighting? Just get low, let us not pay attention, focus on a few other areas. So I think understanding where violence levels are and what they look like is an important piece for will to fight. I do think we can be much more clear in how we approach this concept by really stating, here's what we expect, and this is where kind of in the tips that I pulled together on how to actually do a good job building militaries in fragile states. I'm very clear, what is it we expect this force to do? I mean, no kidding. Who are the bad actors I think they're going to go against? Who are the bad actors I want them to go against? And then do I see examples of them actually engaging in those? And indeed, all of that might lead to a much higher level of violence, perhaps. And yet, that's also a positive indicator. So sort of in a qualitative way, I look at a bunch of variables related to that to try to figure it out temporally. I should note that adds to the point that I was making about 10 minutes earlier. If you are on the ground, you need to be comfortable saying, this is happening or this isn't happening, because folks are going to get the evidence that you tell them and they will use it. They will extrapolate it and say, hey, this super smart captain told me things are going really well in this place for A, B, and C reason. If you buy that, that's meaningful. If that's actually not what you're seeing, that's really, really dangerous. I think there was a question up this way.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. You advocated deeper engagement with certain states. Well, with recent increase in writings that advocated reduced U.S. presence, for example, like Barry Posen in his strategy of restraint, if the U.S. were to adopt this policy, how do you believe our capabilities in shaping our global environment will be affected? And in addition to that, and over time as U.S. power relatively declines around the world, do we need to ask more of our allies for continuing this mission, or is U.S. leadership essential?
I am a strong believer in U.S. leadership and internationalism. Anyone here follow sports? I assume so, right? All right. So I don't know a lot about sports, to be totally honest. My husband's continually trying to teach me, and it doesn't work. But I'm from Wisconsin, so obviously I'm a Packers fan. So here's the deal. Imagine you're the Packers and you're playing the Bears. America's going to be the Packers here, obviously, because we're the good guys. You're the Packers. It's good to be the Packers, right? Packers are occasionally a good team. Now imagine you're also the ref. That's a pretty awesome game. Not only am I playing in the game, but I'm setting the rules in the game, and I'm making all the calls.
That's New England.
You've definitely gone further out from my level of understanding, but that works. So that's U.S. internationalism, right? Post-World War II, you have a system. You have a system politically, economically, security, you name it. You have a system where the U.S. is not only the big dog on the field, but also the referee, also the one setting all the rules, which means you can shape what that landscape looks like in all sorts of ways that are helpful to you. Now, the U.S. recognizes through a number of administrations that all boats need to rise and tries to push that, but obviously, at the end of the day, this is not just altruism. And we should not just see that as altruism. It's the same thing with allies, right? We're consistently pushing allies, spend more, do more, et cetera, right? And that absolutely makes sense. It is also important to note that I care that they want to be on my team, right? How many allies does China have? Russia?
Belarus.
I mean, Belarus, right? It's true. Belarus, I mean, France, UK, I mean, I can just start going down the list, and that's just Europe. And then I turn to Asia. There is something to be said when everyone wants to be on your team. So if we play out our football analogy a little bit more, you not only have the Packers playing, and so you're the Packers and you're the ref beating the Bears, but you have 3 other really good NFL teams who are also playing on your side. Obviously, the Bears are going to lose then. So I think that this system of U.S. engagement with the world makes a lot of sense. I think it is why we have seen the safest period of time in world history and continue to do so. You do note a really important point, which is the relative balance of power is shifting, right? To some extent, this has been a little bit of an anomaly, particularly in the post-Cold War world. We didn't really have a competitor, right? We didn't really have to worry about another state. Indeed, frankly, it's part of the reason why the US can spend 17, 18 years focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, because there's not a huge push to look at something else. Only in the last few years have folks been saying, really across the national security apparatus, hey, we need to worry about China. And then only most recently has it been, hey, we need to worry about Russia. Right? So you're able to really focus in on what is arguably not at all an existential threat of terrorism. So to the extent that you recognize this balance of power is shifting, there's even more of a reason to try to engage others. There's even more to make sure you're still the ref, you still have everyone playing on your team, but you're probably going to need to change the rules of the game a little bit because of this balance of power. But I think it's clear you want to be the Packers in this situation.
Probably have time for one more question. If anybody's, yeah.
Ma'am, I want to talk about what you said about third-party actors and those who don't necessarily support like U.S. involvement in other militaries. The most prominent example I can think of is ISIS, who not only have like similar regional cultural ties to the region, like they understand Syria and the Sunni-Shiite divide, but a lot of their propaganda involves, twisting U.S. involvement and kind of trying to make that propaganda to work against the United States. So that puts us at a disadvantage in trying to work in areas like that where, it's not a state group, it's not a formal group. So they have different rules, they have different boundaries, and it's less hard to attack and punish them for intervening. And they have similar cultural ties where we don't. Like, how does that change how we work with those militaries?
Absolutely. That's a superb question. It is a real challenge. And yes, it puts us at a disadvantage. In the post 9/11 Pentagon, there was all sorts of debates about exactly what you're saying, right? We were sort of looking around and saying, come on, these terrorists don't follow the rules that we follow. Look at all the disadvantages that that's putting us at, right? And by the way, we're really nervous about another attack, right? Every day after becomes September 10th, 2001. And that clouds your thinking, to be clear, to say nothing of just the general exhaustion of working in that environment. But we see when the US does not live up to its values, that actually it hurts us a whole lot more. So I remember being in the Middle East just after Abu Ghraib broke, and I will tell you, those Abu Ghraib pictures were everywhere. I was a graduate student bopping around Lebanon and Bahrain and Kuwait and what have you, and those pictures were outside every mosque I was walking by. That was so problematic to what we were trying to do. And still today comes up in regular conversation. So if you don't live up to your values, in the near term, you might get a little benefit. In the long term, it will severely hurt you. So ideally, what do? You try to really understand what's going on in these places. So when we were at lunch, Dr. Biener and I were talking to a cadet who's studying Russian. And that struck me. 10 years ago, I suspect very, very few cadets were studying Russian. And no doubt that has probably shifted. I see it in my own students at Hopkins, frankly. And that's a good thing. And frankly, it'll be interesting to see what happens with your generation. In fact, this is what my next book is about. Your generation is, we are assuming, going to have to deal with probably high-end conflict and competition with China and Russia. All your bosses have been spending the last 17, 18 years dealing with the Middle East, right? Dealing with CT fights, counterterrorism fights, and counterinsurgency fights, right? So what is that going to look like, and how will that influence it? Now, it does mean that they will have really nuanced understanding of the Middle East. They'll get that this is Sunni, Shia, Arab, Persian, nationalism. They'll get that some of this is ideology, some of this is just states that aren't actually capable of governing and taking care of their populations. All sorts of other issues. They will get that. And yet, that might not be terribly relevant to the sorts of conflicts that you all might have to deal with. I think that'll be really fascinating.
I guess I just got a few closing comments and then one short question, or should have a short answer. I guess for those of you who are going to go to grad school, I mean, Mara's exactly right, the kind of professor you want, someone that's been in the government but actually studied it, researched it, that drives the relevant, policy relevant research out there. The other thing, she pointed out, learning, questioning what she did before, not just kind of being blindly locked in on that, able to overcome that cognitive dissonance that, hey, guess what? Maybe I've been doing the wrong thing in the past, and you got to constantly question yourself if you want to improve. So, as one, it's always constantly, seeking to get better. This is something that they should be doing. What are you reading right now? What would you recommend, other than your book, for the cadets to read? What would be something you would recommend? It doesn't have to be right in the field or whatever.
Oh gosh, I have so many books that I would recommend. Well, right now I'm taking my students in March on a staff ride to study the French resistance in World War II. So we're going to think about issues of resistance and collaboration. It's a little bit of a non-traditional staff. Do you all know what staff rides are? Some of you may know. right? So Prussian General Staff, try to study a conflict, go there, live roles in that so you can really think through lessons learned and what have you, not just lessons encountered, as the Brits say. So my head is really right now in early 1940s France and trying to think through what does it mean to collaborate and what does it mean to resist, and how do we think about that sort of warfare where there aren't bombs falling on Paris, but it's pretty clear the Nazis are in charge. So that I think is just fascinating stuff. A couple books I generally recommend folks read to the extent you have free time, of which I suspect you have none. One of my favorites is Thinking in Time by Neustadt and May. Effectively, Neustadt and May say, look, you're human beings. You're going to use analogies all the time, so at least do so smartly. I promise you, if you have not yet heard someone say, Afghanistan is just like Vietnam, or something along those lines, you will hear that in the next 2-3 years, right? That's how human beings operate. We use analogies all the time. Cuban Missile Crisis is happening. President Kennedy is reading about World War I and how it starts. That's what we do. So how do you make sure to use that smartly? I always recommend Supreme Command, best book on civil-military relations that's out there. I think Masks of War is a really fun book. Right now, most of the folks you know your age, I suspect, if they're in the military, they're in the Army. It turns out the Army is very different from the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. And Masks of War is a terrific book that talks about kind of service culture and helps you understand that. Another book that I love is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I think actually this is the book I'm most obsessed with these days. You all have heard the term paradigm shift. So this is the author who invents the term paradigm shift. And I think right now we're in a paradigm shifting mode. And that is a terrific book because he helps you think through, what is my paradigm? How have I put all these appendages on my paradigm so that it looks like Frankenstein? And then how do I move to another one? I will not give you more for the reading list, but
that's 3 years worth of reading for you. All right.
But I always have more.
Yeah, thank our speaker for coming.
Thanks
today.
so much.